1082. We are continuing with the study of fraud calls in Canada. Welcome to Mr. Matthew Gamble, Internet Society of Canada, and Mr. John Lawford, Public Interest Advocacy Centre. So, gentlemen, you will each have 10 minutes to present, after which we will go into rounds of questions from the members of Parliament. If you see me waving this little yellow flag, I'm not surrendering. What I'm doing is I'm giving you the heads up. You have 30 seconds before the end of the round of questions, and then we will move to the next round of questions. I'm going to remind folks in the audience that there is absolutely no photos to be taken during committee. And with that, I will start with Mr. Gamble. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, members of Parliament, staff, and hearing participants. My name is Matthew Gamble, a director of the Internet Society Canada chapter, and I'm pleased to appear before you today to speak about fraudulent and nuisance calls in Canada. First, a word about who we are. The Internet Society Canada is a not-for-profit corporation which engages on internet, legal, and policy issues to advocate for an open, accessible, and affordable internet for all Canadians. An open internet means one in which ideas and expression can be communicated and received except where limits have been imposed by law. An accessible internet is one where persons and all interests can freely access websites that span all legal forms of expression. And an affordable internet is one by which all Canadians can access internet services at a reasonable price. For more information about our board, our activities, and our publications can be found on our website. The Internet Society is fully aware of the impact that fraudulent and nuisance calls have on Canadians. According to a study by Truecaller, Canadians receive on average 12 spam calls per month, and my personal experience tells me that number is far, far higher. In the case of fraudulent and robocalling, such as the CRA scam calls, it's increasing for several reasons. It's inexpensive to do, it has little to no consequence, and sometimes, albeit rarely, it is effective in defrauding innocent Canadians of their hard-earned money. Between the CRA scam calls and the endless calls for duct cleaning services, it has come to the point where people are hesitant to pick up any unknown caller and have lost trust in their own telephones. Some background on my experience in this area. 13 years ago, I was the chief developer and architect of Primus Canada's telemarketing guard service, which, at the time, was a major step forward in the fight against unwanted calls. Based on a community-driven list of known nuisance callers, it was very effective and stopped millions of telemarketing calls from reaching Canadians. In the intervening years since its development, however, the landscape has changed dramatically, and systems which filter solely based on calling line ID are no longer effective. Bad actors now routinely spoof valid numbers or generate random numbers similar to the person they are calling, commonly known as neighbor spoofing. This new wave of bad actors are exploiting principles wired into the DNA of telecommunications networks. They were built based on explicit trust between carriers, set up to make sure that calls get through no matter what. Carriers don't look at the content of calls before connecting them, and multiple companies can touch each call, making identifying the source of calls a daunting, if not impossible, task. On the surface, the solution of the current robocalling crisis may sound simple. Just forbid calling line ID spoofing. But the solution, sadly, is never that simple. There are good feature, business, and privacy-related reasons for allowing call spoofing. For example, imagine a women's shelter is trying to contact a domestic abuse victim at home without the abuser knowing. They may spoof the calling line ID to mask the source of a call to know that it's not coming from the shelter. Other, more even basic phone features, such as call forwarding, or a business having multiple telephony providers, rely upon the ability to set calling line ID dynamically. It's an integral feature of how the PSTN operates and something that cannot easily be disabled without significant collateral damage. The CRTC, as you heard earlier this week, is working with the Canadian telecommunications industry in attempting to fight this problem on several fronts, including requiring calls to have valid calling line ID, directing the CRTC Interconnection Steering Committee to develop a traceback process, and directing carriers to implement the stir-shaken framework for the authentication and identification of calls. Of all of these initiatives, the Internet Society is most interested in the deployment of stir-shaken for the identification of calls. Born out of technologies borrowed from the Internet Standard Working Groups, stir-shaken promises to restore consumers' faith in calling line ID through the use of digital signatures placed in call metadata. When implemented fully, it promises to allow carriers to identify the source of calls in real time and easily filter parties that are spoofing known numbers such as the CRA, RCMP, and others. The major challenge when implementing stir-shaken in Canada, and why we've been intervening in these respective CRTC processes, is that there are serious policy, technology, and privacy issues that have not been addressed yet with this technology. First, on the policy issues. Stir-shaken standards were developed by the Internet Engineering Task Force and then adopted by several large U.S. providers for use within their own networks. Since this adaptation was done by large carriers, several early policy and design decisions were made that benefit large carriers at the expense of smaller ones. The largest of these decisions was to limit the ability to fully attest to the identity of a call to the phone company which owns the number. While this seems logical, ownership of phone numbers is not as simple as it sounds. There are over 1,200 entities registered with the CRTC as resellers of telecommunications services, which are generally telephone service providers, or TSPs, who operate without owning any of their own phone numbers, instead relying on wholesale access agreements with larger providers. These providers deliver valuable telecommunications services to Canadians, including services such as business-hosted PBX platforms, residential over-the-top services, and other innovative voice products. The CRTC, as you know, has asked all telecommunications providers, including the non-facilities-based providers, to implement STIR/SHAKEN. These smaller carriers will be placed at a major disadvantage when the standards and policies developed to date are implemented if no changes are made. Without the ability to fully sign their own calls, they will be viewed as lesser than larger carriers, and over time, this may cause customers to move their business to larger carriers who can provide full attestation for all calls, thereby creating a two-tiered telecommunications system in Canada, those who can sign and those who cannot. If this happens, it could destroy years of competitive gains and innovations made by smaller carriers. On the technology issues, STIR/SHAKEN poses a challenge as it requires carriers to interconnect with each other over IP-based interconnections using SIP. While the smaller providers I earlier referenced generally interconnect with their upstream carriers using the SIP technology, the interconnections between Canada's larger carriers is mostly based on legacy TDM-based interconnections. It's almost ironic that the smaller SIP-based carriers who are best suited to deploy this technology are being left out of the process, but that's the reality of the Canadian market today. Finally, the Internet Society has some very serious concerns around consumer privacy as it relates to STIR/SHAKEN. Once calls are digitally signed, it will give terminating carriers rich, verified data on the source and destination of calls. The promise is that this will allow telecommunications service providers to develop solutions like Telemarketing Guard, but ones that don't just look at the calling number, but look deeper into things such as the source carrier. This is analogous to spam filtering in the internet space. Analytics are built not just on the source address, but on the reputation of the networks traffic has traversed. While this all sounds wonderful, it poses several issues for the privacy of Canadians, and some carriers have opted to outsource this analytics function to third-party commercial entities. With this data, these third-party companies could easily augment existing commercial data sets to build even more detailed profiles of Canadian households. For example, you can infer from the data collected that a given household was calling for takeout every night, and that data would be valuable to a life insurance provider who may view the unhealthy lifestyle as an increased risk factor. In conclusion, what may sound like we oppose the deployment of STIR/SHAKEN, the opposite is actually true. We firmly believe that the introduction of these technologies into the Canadian telecommunications network is a much-needed step forward in restoring consumers' faith and protecting them from fraud. We just want participants to be mindful that we need to ensure that this technology is implemented correctly and in an open and transparent fashion. And like other internet-based technologies, we must ensure that all players, including small telecommunications providers, can participate on an equal footing. Finally, and above all else, we need to ensure that any technology deployed has strong privacy safeguards built into its DNA. As we learned from the internet, trying to augment a system for privacy after it's deployed is like trying to repair a plane in flight. It's an impossible task that should be avoided at all costs. I thank you for your time, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you very much. And next we will move to Mr. Lawford. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Honourable members, my name is John Lawford, and I am Executive Director and General Counsel at the Public Interest Advocacy Centre here in Ottawa. PIAC is a federally incorporated nonprofit and a registered charity that provides legal and research services on behalf of vulnerable consumers' interests concerning important public services. PIAC regularly participates in proceedings before the CRTC and represents consumer interests in retail banking and payment systems with the FCAC, the Department of Finance, and the OBSI. Consumer fraud is a hot potato. Companies avoid it because they do not want the risk of liability for the fraud. Police have insufficient resources to address its overwhelming size and daunting technical complexity, which changes with each vector. Regulators, like the CRTC, define their jurisdiction narrowly to avoid being responsible for the problem, viewing it as an operational black hole. On an individual level, fraud is humiliating and often devastating. we naturally avoid this issue, like we avoid discussing poverty, because we recoil from the obvious injustice and pain that is inflicted on the victims. Avoiding a problem never makes it better, though. So we commend this committee for insisting that we take a look at one aspect of fraud in today's committee hearing, phone fraud. The statistics that we do have about the scope of the quote-unquote fraud problem are so fragmentary as to themselves pose a problem for dealing with the problem. There is no definitive and official source for them. We have recent data from the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre that show that about 46,000 reports were made in 2019 with 19,000 victims and a loss around $100 million. The calls to CAFC largely covered fraud committed over the phone and internet. However, the FCAC, for example, cited 15 million fraud victims losing $450 million in 2007, likely including other types of fraud, including in person. But more reliable or current numbers are scarce. The CRTC, for example, only has numbers of complaints made in relation to the do not call list and not specific fraud numbers. However, PIAC believes, based on its work in the sector, that the scope of fraud committed by telephone, and that's voice and text fraud, and in part using regular phone numbers, but leaving aside internet-based scams that you might get on your mobile phone, to be 1 to 2 orders of magnitude higher than CAFC numbers. It is also our belief, based on direct contact with consumers and with seniors and low-income groups, such as the National Pensioners Federation and Acorn Canada, that phone fraud both specifically targets and inordinately affects seniors and low-income Canadians, some of whom may be newer Canadians. They can least afford to suffer a fraud. I will not be addressing number porting or SIM swap fraud. It's a recent concern that requires urgent attention, though. Shortly, you'll hear from Randall Baron-Chong, who's both a victim of this fraud and an eloquent advocate for fixing this devastating hack. I will leave it to him to describe. However, I do note that PIAC has called for an open, public hearing at the CRTC with consumer groups, wireless users, CWTA, and major providers. However, so far the CRTC and CWTA has refused to have a public inquiry. Instead, I want to talk today about good old phone fraud, getting a victim to answer their phone, home or mobile, and engage in a conversation with a fraudster, which culminates ultimately in the victim transferring money to the fraudster or revealing so much personal information that the fraudster can then transfer money himself without the victim's knowledge. This sort of fraud can be catalyzed by the spoofing of numbers or call display names to mislead consumers into thinking they are receiving a call from a legitimate agency such as a government department or a local police office number. However, what makes for really good old phone fraud is volume and automation. The more calls made, and the more efficiently made from the scammer's viewpoint, the more likely it is to ensnare a victim. I can tell you that billions of calls are made a year to Canadian numbers, and at least tens of millions of those calls are at stage 1 fraud robocalls. So here's how it works. A program written by a fraudster calls thousands of phones in an hour, usually with a spoofed originating phone number. No people are involved. Now multiply this by many programs, computers, and other scammers doing the same thing, targeting multiple area codes, and you get the idea. Stage 2, however, is the potential victim that answers and does not hang up, but listens to the recorded message, possibly because they trust the source, or they fear the source, or they are simply lonely and looking for some human contact. If the victim presses 1 to hear the message, a live fraudster walks the victim through the fraud to the point of money transfer. So robocalls are just phishing lines flung out to sea of phone-owning humanity. The secondary calls with a live agent are vastly smaller in number. This smaller number is still very large, we just don't know how large. That's where the fraud takes place. So what's new? What's changed in this area lately to give you the impression that we have a phone fraud epidemic, bad word today, and why more and more, especially seniors and low-income Canadians, are falling victim to phone fraud? The answer is that the phone system has been technologically democratized. In the past, to dial multiple numbers, the knowledge of the phone company's network software was required, and this software allowed only a certain throughput of dialed numbers. Now, almost the entire phone system runs on Internet Protocol, and this allows many millions of calls to be made to many millions of numbers and transmitted by a small number of computer operators. While IP-based telephony has allowed new competitors and services, it has allowed fraud to balloon, in part due to the possibility of spoofing numbers with IP, which is harder than with the old software, but the bottom line, so to speak, is that with more phishing lines come more hooked fish. The phone industry, especially legacy carriers such as Bell Canada and TELUS, know this reality all too well. So does the CRTC, which does at least view nuisance robocalls as within its telemarketing jurisdiction, and at least in part deals with numbers on the do not call list. They are all working together on the spoofing part, which the CRTC is already requiring them to block obviously spoofed numbers such as 0000000, and on implementing the stir shaken protocol you just heard about, which really works only entirely based IP-based calls, and all it really does is provide a confidence rating for each call, and that is it allows the recipient software to automatically block these likely robocalls. Both of these measures will help, but would not totally stem the tide. However, there are also new network-level blocking technologies, for example, developed by Bell Canada, and who is now applied to the CRTC to allow this, which is claiming to use AI-based algorithms to identify local, likely robocall sources, along with some confidential extra fail-safes that they've promised, and then to block all such suspicious calls which are transiting Bell's network. And Bell's network is vast in Canada. While this does raise concerns from other carriers that must use Bell's network to connect calls, and it raises it concerns legitimate customers who may have their calls illegitimately blocked, it does attempt to address the volume aspect of our problem. It attempts to use automation against automation, and is likely, we believe, on balance, a positive development. But will it be sold to us or offered free? Lastly, what else is missing? What else is missing to combat the actual content of fraud calls is more authority in this area for the CRTC. And we suggest looking at the US's Telephone Consumer Protection Act and a dedicated anti-phone fraud act. For example, one more akin to the Telemarketing Consumer Fraud and Abuse Prevention Act in the United States. We also notice in this regard that the Broadcasting and Telecommunications Legislative Review Report seems to have missed a chance to recommend amending the Telecommunications Act to give CRTC more authority to deal with fraud calls, or to recommend a dedicated anti-fraud act, whether administered by the CRTC or perhaps by the new Data Commissioner. We also need a better, more centralized and comprehensive and reliable set of phone fraud and internet fraud related statistics and reports to be gathered and publicly released at regular intervals. Finally, we need continual oversight and democratic encouragement by Parliament of work on phone fraud. It is too important to allow this game of hot potato to be played between regulators, companies, and the police. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lawford. And our first round of 6-minute questions will go to MP Gray.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here. My first question is for Mr. Lawford. You had mentioned that people that are elderly and are low income are more vulnerable to phone fraud. And specifically, I know even in my riding of Kelowna Lake Country, I've heard from people that have been targeted both in Mandarin and in Punjabi, and with fraudulent immigration or revenue matters, especially Revenue Canada matters. And what awareness methods can be promoted, do you think, to ensure elderly Canadians and people that are vulnerable don't fall victim to such scams?
Yeah, I think the consumer resilience, if you want to call it that way, could be a lot better in Canada. I think it's only part of the problem, but let's start there. There have been efforts made to reach out in other areas where consumers get defrauded, where there's other languages involved than English and French. It's part of I guess no one's mandate at the moment, and I can't think of who would be doing this. CRTC probably could undertake this type of work to produce materials for people to try to reach out to the community, but it's really one of these things where you have to get direct contact with consumers in a language they understand. How to get out in the communities and get a trusted person to communicate to them, I guess. I'm not sure how that would be directly delivered, but it's a great idea.
Okay. Thank you. You had mentioned something in your opening comments that you were interested in having a public inquiry regarding people who have been victims of fraud, and you had approached the CRTC. Can you maybe give some more details as to what the specific ask was and what the response was?
Sure. That's the issue you're going to hear from Randall in the next panel. It's the SIM swap. So at the moment, the CRTC has exchanged letters with the Wireless Association saying, please tell us what you're doing on SIM swap, because other countries, for example, Australia, have already given rules about avoiding SIM swap. And so there's this exchange of letters on the website, and I'm like, hey, what are you guys doing? Like, why isn't there a public inquiry as we usually do at CRTC? And so far, the answer has been from the companies, we don't want to talk about fraud in public because it might be telling scammers what's going on. And from the CRTC, I don't know why they don't want to do a public inquiry. I think they want the industry to solve it quickly, but I don't understand why that's done, because normally fraud is not helped by obscurity. It's better to discuss it in public. And then secondly, having rules that are done in an open, transparent process usually are better rules.
Great, thank you. I've got a couple questions for Mr. Gamble. You had mentioned that when the development of the Shake and Stir framework was worked on, that it was really with the larger companies, and that you've been bringing a voice of some of the smaller organizations and what their thoughts are. Has anything changed with that? Like, is there consultation happening now with the smaller providers, and are they at the table bringing forth their concerns and their ideas?
So the process right now is with the CISC working group of the CRTC. The concerns of the smaller players are there, although there's only a few of them represented. I will say that a lot of these smaller carriers don't have the resources to participate in these types of forums. They are things that take time from staff, and if you've got a company of 2 or 3 people, it's hard to dedicate somebody to work on technical standards. So far, if you read the CRTC submissions from the carriers to date, they acknowledge that this is an issue, but they say it's something that should be solved at a later date with no real understanding of when that date would be.
So it sounds like they're listening, but they're implementing without actually considering what the concerns are and what the flow through is going to be.
Correct. The view so far seems to be that we should implement with the big players and then let the small players catch up later, which, as you know, trying to fix something after you've done it is always problematic.
Would the small players have to be implemented at the same time, though? And so technically they would all have to implement at the same time, but yet they don't have the capabilities. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. Or they'd be tied to using a single provider as their wholesale source, that all the numbers would have to go through them. They'd lose the flexibility of choosing which wholesale partners they deal with.
Okay. One of the other things was on a related note with IP phone services. I've been made aware of these spoofing, phone calls and these actual prank websites that market themselves as prank websites. Are you aware how the Shaken can identify spoof calls done through these websites, and what's your thoughts on that?
So, when fully implemented, every call will have a source, at least of some level, associated with it. So there's 3 different levels. There's gateway, there's partial, and full. So gateway just says, I know where the call came from on the network. So basically, you know where it was injected from the internet side into the phone network side. So at a minimum, you would know which website it came from, or sorry, which end user it came from.
Okay, so it's still, but there's no regulations or no ways moving forward to actually address these websites. It's more just a matter of knowing where they're coming from.
Correct. There are no KYC requirements in telecom.
Okay. One of the other things is...
Seconds.
Okay. I don't think we'll have time.
Okay.
So
Sorry about that. So our next 6-minute round will be with MP Asasi.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Gamble. Thank you, Mr. Lawford. There There was a lot of information there. Thank you. That was incredibly helpful. Now, in terms of questions, Mr. Lawford, you expressed concern that seniors are, to use your language, are both being targeted and affected. The effect, I think we can all recognize, but is it possible for the perpetrators of fraud to actually target seniors?
The messages that are sent out are ones which are designed to elicit fear or something of interest. I think that they can work targeted, for example, to new Canadians if it's fear-based. The ones that are seniors are more, it might be an interesting offer kind of approach. They can also receive the fear-based ones as well. Both parties are susceptible to these calls, but seniors have the additional, well, there's two things I think I can honestly say. Generally speaking, as one gets older, you get more trusting. And secondly, as one gets older, there is some social isolation. That's what our client groups tell us. And so they are more susceptible just to taking any call. And that is known by the scammer. And that's why the high volumes get targeted at seniors. They're hoping to fish somebody out of there who's lonely, to be honest. I haven't studied the messaging, exactly what's said, but I think that the threats work better on folks who may be newer immigrants.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Lawford, I'm just wondering whether you had a chance to review the transcripts from the witnesses we had a couple of days ago. As you know, we heard from the CRTC, yep, from the RCMP, from Bell, Rogers, and TELUS. Each one of those major carriers have distinct approaches and have different programs that they are suggesting will block and filter. Did you have any comments on any of the approaches that were outlined by the carriers?
Sure. The baseline let's block calls that come from an obviously wrong number, everybody accepts. That's done. Second level is this stir, shake, and stuff. And what the big companies don't like about this is a protocol that you just run on any third-party app or on your phone that will block calls because the calls get tagged as suspicious. And then it's up to you, whether you want to block them or not with your software, how you set it. And so phone companies don't necessarily make that much money on that, but it works fairly effectively. There may be problems with how it's implemented transparently and equally, but leave that aside for now. So stir shaken is what should fix things. It doesn't, they're quite right, catch calls that go outside IP and go through the phone networks, legacy networks, but let's leave that aside too. What Bell and TELUS are both doing at the network level is systems that are sort of a different approach. So TELUS will require this caller to punch in extra numbers in an effort to put a speed bump there. And I believe you can get around that if you're a good programmer. So it may or may not work. They may or may not be selling that to other providers or to other people who have an involvement with the phone system. They may be selling it directly to customers. So this, at the end game, I think, is they probably want to sell it to customers. Bell has a different approach, which is network level blocking, which comes with more concerns about how it's being blocked, why it's being blocked, what the system is, and that's the secret proceeding going on at CRTC right now. I think Bell also would like to sell it to consumers at the end, but I don't know. They have the control, as was mentioned, unlike some other carriers, because they, most stuff transits their networks.
Mr. Gamble, same question. You identified the reality that this is really going to skew competition. It will disadvantage smaller carriers. But just based on the merits of the disparate approaches that were outlined by the carriers, did you have any comments?
I believe that they're trying their best, but they're working in a system where they have imperfect data. As I said with the telemarketing guard system years ago, it was only based on phone number. That's really the only point we have. And until we add more points to the system, such as where calls are coming from, like the actual sources, then filtering will just be trying your best effort to pit machine against machine.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Lawford said that he would be in favor of open and public hearings by the CRTC. Is that something that you would favor as well?
On the issue of SIM swapping, yes.
Yes, you would. Okay. Now, Mr. Lawford, you identified that the U.S. has done a better job. Specifically, you referred to the U.S. Telephone Consumer Protection Act. Is that something that you would be in favor of a similar approach being adopted in Canada?
Yeah, I think that the CRTC needs a little more jurisdiction to try to address fraud more directly. At the moment, wire fraud, if you will, in Canada isn't an offense. It's an offense to do fraud after you make a connection with somebody on a phone call. And what CRTC can do now is only go after you for the facts of the robocalls. But when it comes to the fraud, they don't really, like Mr. Scott said, have any jurisdiction there. And that's, I think, the missing piece.
And
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for that for you, Mr. Sassi. Monsieur Lemire, vous avez 6 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, thank you for your presentation. This is in the context where I just crossed one of my elderly constituents who was a victim of fraud. I don't think it was phone fraud, but it does. It's also an important issue. Mr. Tremblay, to my right, is the MP, is a Bloc MP who also works on international trade files and industrial files. So what are your expectations with regards to the CRTC? And us, as legislators, you spoke about an act. You spoke about an act against telemarketing fraud. So what concrete actions can be taken to assist you or to ensure that the situation will regulate? I would say that in the beginning, we should encourage the CRTC to open up an investigation on this SIM swap scam. This is not a huge problem right now, but we will see an increase in the cases. The CRTC is constrained by its act. They don't have the authority required to do many things. So I don't really know what to say with regards to the CRTC. Maybe you could provide them more tools and the ability to investigate, to look at fraud more closely. Here's a word of caution. Some of these processes are underway right now. Do you have something to add, Mr. Gamble? Anything to add for us?
Deuxième question, est-ce que...
Second question, and I think this could be for both of you in your fields of expertise. Do you feel that the CRTC and even the RCMP understands the scope of these phone frauds or these robocalls linked to fraudulent activity?
Best to do so, but technology is always moving faster, and the minute they understand one, a new one happens.
Parfait.
Yes. Mr. Gamble, earlier on, you mentioned that the smaller companies are at a disadvantage compared to larger ones. And I asked the question to the 3 representatives of telecommunications on Tuesday, do they feel prepared to help? And how can they help? And each of them testified that they were prepared to take action. Do you feel that these actions are actually coming into play? And how can we help the smaller players more?
They want to help, but the way the standards were designed makes it very difficult to do so. And there needs to be some fundamental changes in how we design Shake and Stir to make that a reality.
Et là, bon, il y a tous les délais.
And then we have all the delays that these companies have. The time it takes to get up to standard. It's difficult to implement the technology. Do you think that they're acting in good faith right now?
Knows most of the technology vendors they use, yes, they're working the best they can.
Okay. Ensuite,
Mr. Lawford, do you feel that the CRTC waited too long to act in this issue? Do you feel that some actions could have been taken in a more proactive fashion? As for the spoof numbers, the CRTC is doing its work. They're proactive. But for the SIM swap, it's really chaos. That CRTC ensures us and tells us that there will be a solution without transparency, and this will be only with the companies. And I don't have full confidence in the CRTC for that process. So I think there should be a public investigation to see exactly what they're doing. Another question with regards to the elderly. Do you think that enough actions are being taken with regards to prevention? How we can make sure that seniors can be better protected? In both cases, I think you could have an answer. I have a difficult opinion because for seniors, there's a level at which they can't rise up over if we talk about raising awareness. So it's difficult to raise awareness. We can try to raise awareness, to provide examples, or to have public meetings or meetings in their homes, but at a certain point, we're receiving a deluge of calls, too many calls, and it's impossible not to have victims. And this is the reality. So this is something that that I've retained from your presentation. The volumes, even if the statistics are small, there are a lot of victims. Do you have anything to add with regards to the seniors, Mr. Gamble?
On and all the challenges he mentioned.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. And our next 6-minute round goes to MP Massé.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So all the evidence, though, that right now is that this disproportionately hurts seniors and persons in the low-income sphere. Is that correct?
That's certainly my understanding, and in particular, newer Canadians who may be more scared of calls.
And so to ask both of you is, we heard the companies outline some of the things that they were doing, but they also get an escape from not having to offer free call blocking from the CRTC. It would seem reasonable to me that that call blocking be offered as a universal system, or all this employed, not costing Canadians. They were unclear about what they offered and what they didn't in packages. Is it my experience, and we're going to do the research more on this, that basically you have to pay more as a consumer to get more filtration and protection from fraud? Is that a correct statement, yes or no?
Say yes and no, and then let Matthew finish. Yes and no. Yeah. At the blocking, obviously spoof numbers, that's free, CRTC ruling. From Shake and Stirred, it depends on the way they implement it. And the last one, the network thing, I really think Bell and these guys are going to charge you $10 a month.
And I would just add there are some carriers in Canada who do charge and some who do not. So
yeah, and that's one of the things I'm looking at recommendations for this, is that until Stir Shaken is implemented, that should be actually being provided to consumers right away. I mean, this is a clear abuse pattern that we're seeing happen, and if they're asking for more time for Stir Shaken, that there needs to be a benefit back to Canadians to ebb the tide of this abusive behavior, which is also, I'd argue, a bane on our economy. We saw that with spam in the past, some of the reasons we brought in those laws. Now, would it be unreasonable for consumers to expect similar, though, like a J.D. Powers ranking of some of these carriers in terms of how they deal with fraud? We do that for the auto sector where I come from, and it allows an independent voice to take a look at each, and they can decide as a consumer, what they're getting charged for and what they're getting benefited from. And again, my concern is that if you have more money in your pocket or higher income, you can actually get a better benefit and protection than lower income Canadians. But I think that informing consumers and letting them decide should be something that might be helpful.
If you end up with a system where consumers are paying for some of this protection, then I think having some kind of ranking would be one way to do it. If it's a regulatory requirement that it be offered, then the CRTC should still collect statistics to see if they're complying and how good their systems are. And if they're below standard, then we could look at ways to try to improve each carrier.
Yeah, the end result once Shaken and Stirred is there and the extra data is available is it'll be close to what spam filtering is today. So you'll be able to judge based on how much spam you receive. So there'd be metrics available.
Yeah, then the key, though, is that with some of the systems, if you can't afford some of the upgrading of the systems, then you're not going to be one for that. So the new devices that are going to be capable of this either have to be mandated or you have to replace them, which is also going to be an economic boom for some and a detraction for others, and also more complicated for some people that don't have the ability to swap their phone plan or program out sooner than others. So that's going to be a big issue for that. At this point, should we ask the Privacy Commissioner for commentary? I know that the CRTC, the problem with the CRTC that we have, quite frankly, is it hasn't had a major overhaul in over 20 years. So expecting them to be able to make some of these changes alone without a legislative change from Parliament is going to handicap them very significantly. Should we ask for advice from the Privacy Commissioner for stir shaken in this issue?
I believe we should. There's serious implications when data gets passed to third parties for analytics that have not been addressed yet.
I just add that thinking about digital policy in a more holistic way will help us a lot, and we're not quite there yet. So involving the Privacy Commissioner would assist with stir shaken, but with the other network level blocking as well to see if there's any concerns, and perhaps including, if it comes into being, the Digital Commissioner Office.
Yeah. Do I have any more time?
A minute and a half.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. When we are looking at some of our international obligations for trade agreements and that, should this be one of the things that we include as one of the actual components? The new USMCA has the digital charter as part of it, but is this something that we should be looking at with regards to our trade agreements in other countries?
By that you mean protecting any regulations we set up to,
or
require this?
Yeah, maybe some type of oversight or some type of even a side agreement or related to telephone and internet abuse and fraud.
I would say yes, from our group's point of view, but then getting it as part of an overall digital policy that goes with trade policy that makes sense is the trick.
Okay. I don't know if you have any comments on it. Okay. And then there's you mentioned more work on fraud from Parliament Hill. Can you give me more specifics in terms of what you think we can do under the current context that we have, and maybe some regulatory improvements?
The goal of the comment at the end of my remarks was the fraud provision in the criminal code may need to be made more specific for telephone delivered or phished fraud, if you will, or internet.
You still have 10 seconds.
10 seconds. Thank you. Well, that's good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we will move into 5-minute rounds, and the next round will go to MP Van Poptap.
Thank you. So my question is for Mr. Lawford, and really following up on what Mr. Matthew was just asking about, and that is the CRTC. It's obviously a key player in this whole thing, fight against fraud, telephone fraud and internet fraud. And you were suggesting that perhaps it's time for an investigation into the effectiveness of the CRTC. Is there something missing in its enabling legislation, or is just ineffectiveness of the organization?
Won't go quite as far as ineffectiveness of the organization. They have a mandate, which is limited now, to stop telemarketing that's illegal and to do the do not call list. And that's it. Their job is not to stop fraud, as Mr. Scott said very clearly.
But would it,
sorry, go ahead, please.
So would it be helpful if the CRTC were to have its mandate expanded? What can parliamentarians do to help?
Yes, it would help.
And specifically, like what?
Well, this is the question of how to design a law that would specifically call something phone fraud or wire fraud, as they call it in the United States. So that it's a separate fraud offense. And you could think of things, for example, at the moment, getting somebody to prosecute a fraud is difficult because you can't go back up the chain, if you will, and make everybody who was involved in the calling and then the actual person talking and then the people who own this thing and run it, whether they're in Canada or not, to be liable criminally for it. We could maybe design a law that makes everybody in the calling operation have some level of criminal liability. To make it a less attractive, consequence-free kind of thing, as Mr. Gamble said.
Good. One of our presenters earlier this week said that despite having identified hundreds of thousands of fraud callers, they need approval of the CRTC to actually block them from reaching their customers. Would you agree with that?
The current interpretation of the Telecommunications Act supports that view.
I mean, here's the weird thing about this whole area. The calls that are made by robocalls are illegal. You're not allowed to call for commercial purposes with robocalls. The end. The only exceptions are for hospitals and schools and things. So the calls are illegal. But once somebody answers by pressing 2 or 1 and they talk to somebody, that call only becomes fraud when you finally send the money. So while this person is trying to scam you, there's no crime going on. So that's the trick. And how do you make that part easy to solve and stop? The companies can't listen to the content because they need a warrant. So that's the conundrum we're facing.
Is there an easy solution to that?
Not an easy solution, but I'm suggesting perhaps there would be a well-crafted law that might, if there are actual victims who do lose money, that trace it back to the calling operation. And if you can prove that all those calls were sent out as stage 1 phishing, and look, I got this fish on the hook, and there were enough fish on the hook that we should prosecute the whole operation, maybe there's some way to do that.
Now, in this fight against telephone fraud, how much, we talked about CRTC and its regulatory power, but how much of an effective tool can technology be? And I'm thinking specifically of Stir Shaken. One of our presenters earlier this week had said that they are ready to roll it out, but people's personal devices don't have the technology yet.
So there are two sides to Stir Shaken. There's the network side, which we're more interested in, which is where we can do it at the network level and block the calls before the consumer's phone even rings. And then there's what they refer to, which is the presentation layer, that check mark or that notification to the end user on their phone that it's a blocked call. There's a lot we can do to prevent the obvious stuff at the network level, and then the more fine-grained stuff will require new handsets and things like that.
And how long is that likely to take?
That's unknown at this point because the standards are still being worked on for that display level of things. And then we have the issue of all the Canadians who don't have even digital phones, the elderly, et cetera, who still have analog devices that are incapable of even displaying augmented data.
All right, so the timing of that is obviously going to rest significantly on consumers' ability or willingness to buy into the new technology.
Correct, although we'll get some benefit day one from the network level of things.
I have a question from Mr. Gamble. 20 seconds. I will defer that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the next 5-minute round goes to MP Johari.
Madam Chair, I'll be sharing my time with MPKC. Quick 2.5-minute question and response. Mr. Gamble, you talked about Stir Shaken, you talked about the policy, the technology, and the consumer privacy, specifically around data source outsourcing for analytics. You also talked about the disadvantaging the smaller carrier. But what you said that stood out for me was that there should have been some design consideration at the outset that somehow got missed, that may have resulted in this disparity. Can you share some light on what those design changes should be to bring those two back together? Thank you.
I'm not going to try to dive really deep into the level of the technology design decisions that would warrant this, but the real challenge is that there's no easy way to move the ownership of a phone number from one party to another and sort of delegate that responsibility. That's being worked on now, but in digital certificates, that's highly difficult. It really comes down to how we treat the reseller phone companies. They've always, in the phone networks of Canada, been lesser than the parents, but there's never been a reason for that to be an issue. I think if we allow more carriers to rise up to the facilities-based level, which with SIP interconnections, things like that, we can solve some of these issues. But it really goes back to how the whole resale system was designed and can't easily be overhauled.
Do I still have some time?
You have 3.5 minutes.
Well, no, I'm sharing 2.5, so I got about a minute. Okay, can we talk about the consumer privacy and outsourcing of the data that it's for analytics? Is that going to, again, be disadvantaging any of the smaller players?
That's difficult to say. The players don't all say who they outsource their data processing to, and some may not. There's no requirement to outsource to a third-party analytics company, but if you wanted to offer the best spam filtering, you're going to get the best analytics you can get, which may require you to share data with third parties. And those parties are generally right now American, and while they say they may not share data, you have to worry about A, the data leaving the country, and B, the potential data breaches and data being compromised.
Okay, thank you.
I want to come back to the same point around the weakness in the shake and stir framework because of its unfairness to smaller players, and you've indicated that it's something that's not easily solved. So, is this something where we may be having the perfect be the enemy of the good? Is this a fatal flaw and one that would justify us not pursuing that, given that it appears, other than the Bell network blocking solution, appears to be one that might work?
So it's not a fatal flaw. There are currently 2 or 3 proposals for solving this floating around the working group known as ADIS. There just hasn't been a consensus on it yet. I believe the groups that will get to a consensus probably in the next 6 to 8 months sort of thing. But when the CRTC says we want it done by September 30th of this year, and the solution to fundamental issues are still 6 to 8 months away, that those two don't really line up together.
And that also ties into something that you said earlier in terms of trying to stay ahead of the fraudsters. This framework, I take it the history in the other jurisdictions has been positive. Are we yet at the stage where the fraudsters are catching up and we need the next generation?
I don't believe so. I think there may be some regulatory changes needed once Shake and Stir is done.
Yep.
Currently, carriers are not responsible for the calls they place onto networks. Once Shake and Stir allows you to identify which carrier is the source of a call, then you could probably empower the CRTC to, if a carrier was known to be the source of a large majority of fraud calls, then they could somehow maybe be found liable for those calls.
Okay, Mr. Lawford, quite interested in your comments around something else that holds promise, this technology that's available through Bell, and your question was whether it will be sold to us or offered for free. What would be the risk to the consumer, or what would be the societal risk of it being offered for free? What sort of reaction can we anticipate from Bell? Would we be deprived of it if it was mandated that it be free?
Not necessarily, because Bell, I believe, also wants to stop fraud calls because people are canceling their landlines, right? So one of their reasons for doing this is just to stop the bleeding. So they may well do it anyway. They just may want to sell it in certain contexts. Non-consumer contexts, I believe, would be fine. Mm-hmm. But at the consumer end, my only concern is not having some people have this technology, others not.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. I would like to thank you both for being here today. We have to wrap it up a few minutes early because our next group requires some technical things to be happening. It'll take us about 10 minutes to set up for the next group. So I'd like to thank you again for coming, and I hope you have a great afternoon. Thank you. A gentle tap.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you could take your seats, we're going to begin. So thank you again. Welcome to the Standing Committee on Industry, Science and Technology. We are doing a study on fraud calls. With us today, we have Mr. Randall Baring-Chong, co-founder, Canadian SIM Swap Victims United. And from video conference, we have Kate Schroeder, board member of the Canadian Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse. Welcome, both of you. You will have 10 minutes each to present to the committee, after which we will go through tours of questions from the members of parliament. If you see me waving the yellow card, that means you have 30 seconds. That doesn't mean don't look at me so you don't see the card, but that means you have 30 seconds to wrap up your response. Because we want to make sure that we don't lose Mrs. Schroeder, who's coming in from video conference, we'll start with her. So, Madame Schroeder, you have 10 minutes.
Perfect, thank you. Good morning, Madam Speaker, and thank you to you and the committee for including us in the conversation surrounding this important topic. My name is Kate Schroeder, and I'm a board member for the Canadian Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse, also known as the CNPEA. So a little bit about the CNPEA. The CNPEA is a pan-Canadian network supported by leaders in the field of aging, research, healthcare, and elder abuse prevention and response, among others. The CNPEA connects people and organizations and fosters the exchange of reliable information, advances programs and policy development on
Madam Schroeder, I'm sorry, can I ask you to hold 1 second? Just we're having some technical difficulties. We can't hear you. If you could hold 1 moment.
Of course.
Thank you. If you could say a few words, we just want to see if we can hear you.
Perfect. Can you hear me now? Hello?
Could you speak some more? Could you continue?
So I'll just start again.
Thank you.
Perfect. Good morning. Thank you, and thank you to the committee for including us in the conversation surrounding this important topic. So my name is Kate Schroeder, and I am a board member for the Canadian Network for the Prevention of Elder Abuse, which is also referred to as the CNPEA. The CNPEA is a pan-Canadian network supported by leaders in the field of aging, research, healthcare, and elder abuse prevention and response, among others. The CNPEA connects people and organizations, fosters the exchange of reliable information, and advances programs and policy development on issues related to preventing the abuse of older adults. We do this at a local, regional, provincial, territorial, and national level through our knowledge sharing hub at the cnpea.ca. So we are pleased to have this opportunity to bring to light the challenges and impacts on fraud calls on older adults in Canada. The CNPEA's work focuses on gathering and disseminating adaptable resources, best practices, and current research and policy development by Canadian expert stakeholders to increase our collective capacity to address and prevent the abuse of older adults. The following comments and recommendations are based on the extensive work of some of these experts. So fraud calls are an attempt to deceive an individual to gain control over some aspect of that individual's life, whether it be financial, identity, or other. These types of criminal attempts impact all Canadians, regardless of age, race, education, or background. Vulnerable health, fledgling finances, and a rarefied social network, among other factors, can heighten the risk of falling victim to potential scams, and this risk only increases as individuals age. The rapidly shifting demographic in Canada is impacting all aspects of our country and its economy. By 2031, 23% of Canadians will be over the age of 65. By 2061, there could be 33% more seniors than children living in Canada. This shift is already presenting us with troubling new statistics in relation to fraud, and we expect these statistics to continue to increase as our population ages, as seniors are often identified as easier targets. As of February 29th, 2020, available statistics from the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre indicate that this year so far, there have been 7,804 reports of fraud or attempted fraud. And year to date, over 4,119 Canadians have been confirmed victims of fraud, with over $9.2 million lost. According to the Canadian Anti-Fraud Centre, phone scams have defrauded Canadians out of an estimated $24 million between January 1st and October 31st, 2019. And available statistics indicate that losses experienced by older adults account for as much as 25% of the total losses related to reported fraud, and that this number is rising considerably. The troubling part of these numbers is that they only reflect the fraud that's been reported. From available studies, we know that the reporting rate of fraud may be as low as 13%, often because older victims are afraid or ashamed to be deemed incompetent or other for falling prey to these calls. Fraudulent calls are running rampant across Canada. Current scams are included but not limited to phone spoofing scams, numbers that imitate legitimate phone numbers, Canada Revenue Agency scams, grandparent scams, warrant calls, free reward calls offering trips and cruises, natural disaster scams, technology scams. The grandparent scam, technology scams, and the Canada Revenue Agency scam may be more likely to affect older adults. One of the major contributing factors to this is social isolation, which is considered a heightened risk factor for elder abuse in general. Isolated adults craving human connection, missing their family, or lacking a support network may be more likely to fall for these scams and easily preyed upon. The reason older individuals fall for these scams are often complex and interconnected. Potential risk factors that put individuals at greater risk include possibly the recent loss of a loved one, the lack of a support network, social isolation, economic insecurity, poverty, potential cognitive impairment, lack of awareness or understanding of the nature of these calls, and the sophisticated, ever-changing technology. Falling for these scams often leads to individuals feeling stigmatized. The complicated process of reporting and investigating these types of fraud lessens the chance of individuals completing the reporting process. Some of the issues that we've noticed that impede the reporting process are the fear of appearing incompetent, the fear of having their autonomy or decision-making abilities questioned, the fear to admit to their children or loved ones that they made a mistake, as often talking about money and technology can be a fraught experience between families and parents and children, the potential lack of awareness of where to report, and the potential to encounter ageism when trying to explain their situation. What we are certain of is that these types of fraud calls are on the rise and are impacting all Canadians. So solutions must be unique and intergenerational in approach, as well as collaboratively arrived upon between private and public sectors, consumer groups, financial agencies, and law enforcement. Some of the biggest keys to prevention and detection are awareness, education, and easy access to reporting, as well as respectful and informed approach to communicating and supporting older victims. So our overall recommendations from the CNPEA include to develop awareness campaigns in all forms, so social media, web-based, print, TV, to help people, regardless of age, to understand the different scams and forms of fraud currently circulating, to support and promote bystander intervention training programs at financial institutions, law firms, and other consumer groups, to support the development of programs to help Canadians not only navigate the complexities of reporting fraud, but markedly improve the access to support after reporting to prevent re-victimization, and to encourage the development of awareness and support programs that are accessible from home or other living arrangements, improve the access to regular and affordable transportation in rural areas to prevent social isolation and to facilitate access to necessary resources. And the ongoing proactive communication from various stakeholders, CRA, banks, telecommunication companies, senior service providers to provide updates on current scams impacting older adults. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And next we will go to Mr. Barang Chong. You have 10 minutes.
Good afternoon. My name is Randall Barron Chong. I'm an entrepreneur from Toronto, hence why I wanted to articulate myself through a PowerPoint. Here to represent Canadian SIM Swap Victims United, a grassroots organization of victim advocates from across Canada and across all walks of life, formed as a result of what's described as one of the phone frauds that experts fear most. As victim advocates, we take our harrowing experience into hope for greater awareness, combine that with expert advice, and engage industry and leadership like yourself to promote action with the sole objective of not adding another name to our roster. So, though my story starts back in the end of October 2019, really this begins back in 2007 with one of your former colleagues, Maxime Bernier, who was the Minister of Industry at the time, announcing wireless network portability. And what that was in essence all about was to provide consumers the power to essentially vote with their dollars in terms of moving from carrier to carrier without being encumbered by losing their number. So it was all about empowering consumers and their choice to go to the carrier that they wanted. But while well-intended, like the road to hell, it was paved with good intentions, and it led to the hell that many of us victims know as the SIM swap scam, also known as the unauthorized customer transfer or unauthorized porting. Now, what that essentially describes is the transfer of someone's phone number from their own SIM to another SIM without the authorization of the account holder themselves. So, let's dissect generally of how SIM swapping works. Now, the vast majority of SIM swaps are financially motivated. These fraudsters begin by doing their homework to gather the goods. And what I'm referring to here is getting a real understanding of who these victims are at a personal level, so trying to find some identifiers about them. But really, if they're trying to do it through an unauthorized porting, they want to get these key pieces of information which are required to execute the port themselves. And that is first the phone number itself, and then one of the following. And these are described by the Wireless Network Portability Council, which define these rules. The account number of the holder, the device ID, or a PIN. So if you think about it, you only need the phone number plus one of those pieces of identifiers. And the phone number is highly accessible for most of us. So you've already got half the job done. So how do you get the rest of it? And this is where the methods of these fraudsters takes place. One of the major methods that they use is social engineering, which is taking advantage of the human fallibility of the customer service rep. Oftentimes they'll pretend, I'm the customer, I lost my phone, I desperately need to get a phone back. And so they'll play the system. They might even say they forget their PIN and provide other types of information which are even more accessible, like postal code, maiden name, things like that, to get around it and get access to the porting information. They'll use phishing, fake phone numbers, pretending to, or fake emails purported from Rogers saying, enter your account number, but it's really the hacker that's getting your information. They can also use social media to find personal information about the person. And even recently, through data leaks, TELUS, its flanker brand Koodo, announced that their members, so their customers from 2017 and prior, their account information was compromised by an unauthorized user, and they all had to get port protection put on their accounts. And then finally, and most nefariously, inside employees, and this is something we've seen in the United States, where employees at companies like AT&T and T-Mobile had actually sold account information for $20 or less to these fraudsters. So this is how they execute the port. Now that they have that information, what they'll often do is get a prepaid phone account because there's no identification required to get a prepaid phone because of PIPEDA. And so it's essentially untraceable to these people. And now that they have the information, they'll call to execute the port with that carrier. And under the CRTC decision from 2005, this has to be executed within 2.5 hours or less. And I saw on Tuesday, one of you got a CRA text, CRA scam text. I hope you never see this on your phone where you see your SIM is no longer in service, because that's how the victim finds out that they've been ported over. The victim has not really been involved in. When I had mine happen, it was at 11:40 at night, and I just suddenly saw that my phone was no longer working. I thought it was technical, but it turns out I was being ported. And at that point, from that point forward, any calls that are outbound or inbound, texts, anything like that, are now in the possession of the fraudster themselves. Now, this next stage, which is called Forget It and Reset It, I'm sure many of you with your social media accounts, bank accounts, things like that, have text-based factor authentication. If you forget your password, you click I forgot my password, and it'll send you a text for a one-time password to reset your password. And then essentially they can redefine the password. Now that the fraudster has your phone number, they are receiving those texts or those calls, and they are going in and locking you out of your very own account. And this is when it comes to the plundering. Now, oftentimes these fraudsters will work in teams and will work to create this havoc. And it manifests itself in when you see emails flooding into your inbox saying, your account password has been changed, a new contact has been added to your account, and all you could do is watch. And in my particular case, which happened, as I mentioned, at night, I called my carrier and was told that, thank you for calling customer service. Our hours are from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., Monday to Friday. So they put up a 12-hour defense for an enemy that fights a 24-hour war. To get the phone number back, oftentimes it takes between several hours to a few days in some of the cases that we've seen. So how is the damage done? Well, there's three kind of key ways that they try to take advantage of this. One is a direct theft. Crypto in particular is a flavor that they prefer because it's very hard to trace them afterwards. But there are average victims like the Johnson family of Peebles, Saskatchewan, who lost hundreds of thousands of dollars from their farming account. Others, they take advantage of the apps that have credit cards linked to them, like this nurse, Sheila O'Reilly from Oakville. In my case, they tried to extort and blackmail me. They got access to my cloud drive. And essentially, as a small business person and my personal account all being on this cloud drive, 5 years of my life is now in someone else's hand. And I told this story to someone in the United States who lost $1 million, 90% of his life savings. And he said, your crime, your offense that you had against you was much worse. He feels bad for me. And oftentimes what they'll do is they'll take this data and they'll monetize in the dark web for the low price for login credentials of $20 to $120 to $3,000 for full identification. In other cases, they'll take over accounts. So Jack Dorsey, for example, the founder of Twitter. If the founder of Twitter can be a victim to a crime like this, who amongst us is safe? Even celebrities like Mariah Carey and Adam Sandler have been victims of this. And in other cases, they target accounts which have desirable usernames. There's a man in Toronto named Jack Hathaway who lost his Instagram handle, cosplay, which is a highly valued target. So unlike things like phone spoofing or these other frauds that you heard about earlier, these aren't done necessarily from call centers overseas where we feel we're helpless to take action on this. As recently as November, an arrest was made of an 18-year-old from Montreal who has participated in the theft of $300,000 from Canadians and over $50 million from Americans. And what this really demonstrates is that these aren't sophisticated, programmers and hackers and coders that are doing this. These are the people who know the play to the game. And these are commonly done in the arrests that have been made in the United States, for example, by people under the age of 25. So what we came to this realization is that our phone numbers are our new form of identity. Our SIM is like our new sin. And security is as strong as the weakest link, whether it's technical or human. And then finally, when it comes to unauthorized porting, it can have lifetime impact. So we need to change the way we think about these things. So how's it being dealt with elsewhere? In the United States, they're treating it as a national security risk. In places like Africa, they're using their cooperation between the banks and the telcos to identify fraud risks. In Australia, they've actually taken regulatory action to introduce pre-porting processes to identify whether or not you actually validated the request. And they've even introduced fines for telcos that don't comply with the authorized porting process.
Unfortunately, that's your 10 minutes for presentation.
Okay.
I want to thank you, though, for sharing your story. And I know we have your documentation, and I hope that in the rounds of questions, you'll have a chance to also give us more information. So with that, we will start with the 6-minute round. Our first round of question is with Ms. MP Patzer. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much. So my first question would be for you, Mr. Baron Chong. So imagining what you've gone through with your own incident, you've obviously done a lot of thinking about different measures that could have prevented scammers from hijacking your number and how Rogers could have protected you. And I think you were kind of building to that here before you ran out of time. So what are some of the ways that you believe providers, or one of the things providers could do to prevent unauthorized number transfers? Maybe if you just want to elaborate on where you were going with what you were about to say.
Apologies for that. So in terms of what we think from the Canadian perspective that can be done is first, there needs to be changes to the regulations and introducing something similar to what Australia has done with pre-porting authorization. So it's as simple as getting a text from the new carrier to say, did you request this porting over? In Australia's, sorry, lost the presentation, but Australia essentially introduced it so that you either have to get a call or a text from the new carrier, and if, let's say, your phone actually is legitimately stolen, you have to go into a store to actually provide government ID to validate that it's you and that you are executing the port. But as you know, John Lawford from PIAC kind of alley-ooped me there and setting up things up, there needs to be more transparency as well around the process. The CWTA has requested that a lot of the information about processes be redacted or not shared, but it's widely known within cybersecurity that security through obscurity doesn't work. And just as an example of that, one of the things that Rogers did was they texted people to say, we received a request that you wanted to port your phone number. If it wasn't you, call us. And this fails on 3 different levels. First, there are instances where people, because of the distrust that's been caused by all these frauds, that they think that it's a fake text in itself, so they just ignore it. And then the port still gets executed within that 2.5 hours. In the second case, there's been instances where people have been trying to reach them through the hotline, and they are never able to get through. One port was executed within 12 minutes of receiving the text. And in the third case, if a really smart fraudster looks at it, they'll look at your social media, find out when you're on vacation, and then execute the port, so you don't even have your phone on you. So there are obvious ways that we can at least temporarily get rid of this, and then we need to move away from SMS-based two-factor authentication entirely.
Right. Yeah, so what other modes of two-factor would you, or is there just a whole different other means as well, other than just what Australia is doing that you would like to see?
Yeah, so there's something called soft token authentication. So there's things like Google Authenticator or Authy or things like that, which are available for quite a few different types of like apps and things that we use. So a lot of social media offers it, but often it's a secondary offered form of authentication. It's not widely known. It's only accessible to smartphone users, unfortunately. But there are still a lot of things that we use where they promote two-factor authentication by SMS, and still banks often promote that only.
Thank you for that. My next question will be for you, Kate. So during the last meeting, I raised the growing problem of scammers, which are increasingly targeting people through online, social media, or text messaging. We know that young Canadians are present on these platforms, but could you just say something about how this issue might be particularly affecting seniors?
Yeah, so I think there is a bit, not a misconception, but definitely social media is extremely prevalent with our younger generation. But it is extremely prevalent also with our senior Canadians. Facebook is a very, very hot, popular thing for our aging Canadians, and is unfortunately a breeding ground for fraud, romance scams, all of those types of things. So I definitely think, and it all stems back to that need for connection, that want for a relationship, to feel connected. It's that social isolation piece that we focus on that is really stemming those connections that our senior population are trying to build in that social network.
Yeah, for sure. So then also for the education and even the awareness side of things as well too, you know, what more needs to be done, and are there already steps being taken, you know, by groups such as yourself to get that education and that awareness done for seniors? Like, is there programs out there that they can understand and help them be aware of these things?
Yeah, I think there's certainly programs out there. You know, I know the Canadian Competition Bureau, they have the Little Black Book of Scams. It's available. It talks about all of these things, but it's promoting these resources that are available and having them widely available in all sorts of different social services, banks, agencies, right? It's really promoting that. I think that there is a need. And again, because our senior demographic is so robust, you know, where one person may see it online, one person may see it in print, we really have to cover off all of those areas. So I would say there is a need for a more robust promotion of those materials that are out there and the new things that are coming out. So to speak to what Mr. Baron-Chong just said too, you know, these types of scams as well, like I feel like everybody, you know, we're really good at promoting the CRA scams and the romance scams and things like that. But there needs to be, I feel like, more robust communication from telecommunication companies, things of that nature, on the emerging scams, the things that people need to be aware of.
Thank you so much. And our next round of questions will go to MP Jacek.
Ms. Schroeder, I really appreciate what you've had to say to us, and I totally concur with all that you've said. One of the previous witnesses we had, Mr. Lawford, made reference to the fact that perhaps some seniors are actually giving up their landlines because they are so fed up with phone scams and nuisance calls and so on. Are you aware of any of that? Has that been an issue at all for your clients?
So I certainly think that, yeah, it is happening. I think our world is certainly moving, and as our demographic continues to age, our world is moving to a more mobile cellular network type of environment, certainly. But I think we can all concur that that doesn't necessarily eliminate the problem. So, you know, I think, it's twofold. If they're simply just eliminating their landlines, you know, there's obviously concern there that only adds fuel to the fire of social isolation, that only adds fuel to the concern that if something is wrong, how do we ever find, you know, how do we get in touch with these people? How do we make sure that they're safe and they're okay? But, and again, the cellular network piece of it, we all know that that is not, we get just as many fraud calls on our cellular devices as we do our landlines. So I definitely think we're seeing that. I think it's concerning because it won't, you know, it only adds more concern to the potential risks to those individuals.
Exactly. So the point really, and as Mr. Baron-Chong has alerted us to, if they give up their landline, they're going to obviously start relying on cellular phones and presumably just as vulnerable to this SIM swap scam that we've just heard about, which was totally new to me as of yesterday. So I'm extremely grateful to have heard a lot about this. Mr. Baron-Chong, could you, again, because you weren't quite able to finish your presentation, you've talked to us about Australia and the need to actually personally attend. If somebody claims to have lost their phone, they have to personally attend, show their government ID, etc. But could you talk a little bit about what you feel the CRTC should be doing given the facts?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think first codifying that within the regulations is important, because what often we've seen the carriers do is to fall back on saying we're complying with the regs, but those were written back in, you know, the decision was back in 2005. And, you know, obviously the kind of threat environment has changed quite significantly. The CRTC also needs to, as Mr. Lawford alluded to earlier, be much more transparent about not only and asking the CWTA and the industry to be more transparent about the prevalence of this. Are they effectively dealing with this? We appreciate that the CRTC issued the letter back in January 15th of this year, but the letter that came back from the CWTA was highly redacted for anything that was interesting to us, what the measures that were being taken, what's the prevalence, and there was no sense from us what the CRTC would assess as effective measures from the industry, what kind of potentially enforcement measures they take if they didn't, act upon this, what the implementation schedule was, because the longer that this persists, the more victims that'll rack up.
So one of the recommendations would be a public airing of the CWTA's response, or how do you see this practically going forward?
Right, thank you. I think at least there needs to be recognition that, especially for the customer-facing elements in terms of the protections that are introduced, there should be more disclosure about that and participation of customers in that. Because like I said, with the issue with the text that went through, because people weren't aware that that was a new protection measure they introduced, they were immediately skeptical of it. So these kind of measures, they need to be more publicly aired. I can understand, though, there needs to be a part that's addressed around training their staff more. I can't tell you how many times I've called my telcos and had to teach these customer service reps about their porting policies. And in fact, up until last night, I actually almost used social engineering to get my PIN from someone who really didn't, who I provided information that's very easy to obtain. So there needs to be a training of employees too, and I can understand if that part is something that's done, not publicly disclosed necessarily, but there needs to be two sides of this.
We pulled up an article on SIM scamming yesterday, and apparently there's some advice from the OPP to people on how they could protect themselves. Obviously, you've talked about the personal information, do not answer phishing emails, text messages, use an offline password manager. So this is something, again, that was completely new to me. Could you explain what that is?
Yeah, so that was the soft token authenticator that I was alluding to earlier. So those are like Google Authenticator. So what it does is it generates a code on your phone, and it would ask you to essentially replicate that number that you're getting on your app and put it in. So instead of getting a text message, you're using that number. You can also use a hardware token. So some people might have seen those kind of RSA keys that generate a number as well. So a hardware or a soft token could be used to authenticate. But essentially, you just don't want to tie it to your phone.
That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And la prochaine question.
Next question, Mr. Lemire. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to continue with Mr. Baron-Chung. I'm very sympathetic to what you experienced.
Your reality, and I'm appreciate that you push to have some present experience to help other people in prevention. Je vais revenir en français.
I'll go back to French. You talked about your expectations with regards to the CRTC. Thank you, Mrs. Jacek, for having raised this. Do you have any expectations with regard to the RCMP and telecommunications companies, or the CRTC? Anything that you'd like to share with us?
The CRTC, the RCMP are a telecom company to could prevent situation like yours.
So,
Do you have a translation?
yeah, I can't.
It does. It's not working.
Yeah.
Okay, one moment.
Testing 1 2. Hang on. I stopped the clock, Mr. Lemire. Testing 1 2 3. This is the English channel. Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3. Testing. This is the English channel.
There was recognition, I think, by the different law enforcement agencies that have been dealing with this, that there needs to be more coordination, because even though maybe these criminals are working in teams that are close to each other, these victims span across the country. So actually, the RCMP is launching a national cybercrimes coordination unit, which will be launching, I believe, at the end of April of this year. And so they'll be able to better coordinate these cases. And, you know, when we have us as victims share our stories, we're often able to almost hear these common denominators between these crimes, and we pass that off onto the law enforcement agents that are working on our cases. But like we said, we need codification of these new types of pre-porting notifications and verifications, more transparency around what's going on with the porting, and ensuring that the telcos are implementing policies and doing it consistently. And then finally, I think governments and industry should be studied in terms of those ones that have sensitive data in whether they're using SMS-based 2FA, and how that we can transition away from that, because otherwise we put ourselves at the peril of SIM swapping.
In your situation, did you receive any type of support, any type of victim support, any type of assistance?
C'est tout?
That's all?
Wow.
Okay. Another question. You spoke about data being sold by fraudsters. How can we assist companies to have a better security system so that data can't be sold this easily? In Desjardins, this is being talked about in Quebec a lot. If we talk about internet security issues, what do you suggest?
I think there's partly responsibility of the individual as well, in terms of their data, let's say what they put into things like the cloud. You know, to some degree, I'm paying top bracket idiot tax for uploading almost everything. I actually wasn't even aware that all that stuff was being uploaded, because I didn't really use it. But I think, you know, I wanted to come forward with my story to just let people know that, you know, you should be careful about what's being put on there. And cyber experts, ironically, are saying, go back to almost being offline. Don't use cloud. Save on an external hard drive. They're even saying don't save your passwords on your browsers. Write it down on paper. Write it in marker so that the pen doesn't imprint on the paper. We're making this kind of 180 turn in terms of how we become more careful about the stuff that we store. So I think at least on the consumer side, that's the most important part, to just be aware of what we have there.
Le message est entendu.
Yes, the message is clear. One last question. Mr. Lafford earlier spoke about public investigation, and this might be relevant. Do you agree with him?
We're almost kindred spirits on that. And I came across his letter when we were doing our kind of look at who are the stakeholders interested in this. You know, I think if we had given our feedback that some of the solutions we thought of, and it was very similar to the Australian solution, and if this was introduced months ago, back when they introduced their text message thing in November, we would not have some of these members in our group, because it would have been prevented. They would have known about it in advance.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I would have a question for Mrs. Schroeder. I'm sorry if I've mispronounced your name. So you spoke about a prevention campaign and the importance of this, and the challenge with regards to rural communities. I'd like to hear you speak to this. Is this worse in rural zones? Are we more concerned about victims in rural areas? How about could an awareness campaign help? Maybe have adapted technology? Is there any kind of technology that would be adapted to seniors that could protect them more?
Yeah, thank you. So I think further to that comment, I guess what my recommendations would be, I think in rural communities, they don't necessarily have as many different social services, the access to as many social services. You know, the greater the population, the more social services, the more facilities, the more things, activities that people can be involved in. So, you know, when we're looking at rural communities where awareness and programming and documentation and all of those things that are out in print, you know, I'll again fall back on
Mrs.
a
Schroeder,
little back.
Ms. Schroeder, unfortunately, that's your time, but maybe the next person will let you continue. The next round of questions goes to MP Massey.
Yeah, thank you. And no, I'll let you finish if you want to finish, Ms. Schroeder, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, I was just going to say, so, you know, I think there is a need for a campaign or to make sure that those resources, and again, it speaks to the need for a collaborative approach. There is a need to ensure that the information that is out there and available is shared amongst all different social services, banks, you know, insurance companies, telecommunication companies. So in places that are less populated or more rural in nature, that same information and those same resources that are available can make it to, you know, to everybody in that demographic.
The seniors that you're working with right now, how do seniors take the advice from the companies with regards to their privacy? I'm less convinced that this has been a high priority for them with regards to the frustration and the where we're at with regards to a particular spot. In fact, we know that fraud prevention is one of the things that there's not a lot of resources for. Even the police here admitted that the RCMP, that sometimes police redirect people to the wrong place to go. Given the fact that people are paying so much out of their pocket for this type of a device, whether it be landline or now it's going to be more for a mobile device, what type of, I guess, are you hearing any supports coming from the telcos to help educate on fraud directed to seniors?
You know, to be honest, I haven't seen it a ton. Unfortunately, my experience is usually after the fraud has occurred, so it's already happened. So that, you know, that prevention piece unfortunately hasn't really worked in those cases. But I would definitely agree with your comments in terms of there does appear to be a lack of support in terms of reporting, dealing with that fraud, where to go, how to report, how to do that. And I think there definitely is a lack of support from the telecommunication companies in terms of providing guidance on the primary scams that are impacting their clients currently. So I definitely think there could be a more collaborative approach in terms of them running those campaigns as well for their client base. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where I'm looking for balancing. There have immense amount of wealth being generated from consumers on this, an immense amount of money going to organized crime or to fraudsters, whether it be petty or not, and there just doesn't seem to be a proportionate response to deal with this issue from people that continue to be victims from it. For the victims in your community, what supports are they provided? Is there any counseling? Is there any, I mean, you have people that don't even become victims, as Mr. Lawson mentioned. It's not a crime until actually you lose it, but I know a lot that, you know, won't even go public. They feel self-shame, self-esteem is lost, they're embarrassed, and do you know of any supports out there? I know our Windsor Police and a few others try to do what they can, but there isn't any core services, and victim services are in need.
So based on, and again, what I've really noticed in the cases that we've been involved in is that it really differs from province to province and territory to territory. So it's very jurisdictional based. You know, there are hotlines available in Alberta and BC. I believe they have specific dedicated hotlines for people. But I do think there is a definite need for an overarching support system, a centralized support system for people based on the situations we've had when we have reached out to police to report fraud. We've had varying degrees of success. We've had really, really great local detachments that have gone to see these clients to help them, to provide them guidance on what to do. And we've had the opposite also, to be frank. So I definitely think we need a more robust, streamlined approach on what clients can, what individuals can expect, what seniors can expect, right? In terms of what to do. The process to report fraud at a financial institution is also it's very difficult. The forms are long, they're confusing to people, and there's not a lot of support there either. So I would say there's a definite need for all of these people and all of these agencies to come together to provide better support.
Quickly over to Mr. Baron Chong. You mentioned about your $100, but I guess your message here is what we've heard from many other experts already, is that prevention is the best strategy. How would you rank the response and prevention in terms of what you've been calling, in terms of when you've reached out for this? Where do you think you're along the road to gain some of the things that you noted here that could prevent some of the things that you were a victim of in the coalition that you support?
Right. Myself and other victims have offered our support to the telcos themselves numerous times and have received nothing but silence so far. We think that, if it's an industry that's truly service oriented and, talks about its best interest is in how to serve us and protect us, they aren't involving us at all. And so far, I think when they've tried to roll things out without, the fingerprints of the users themselves, it's clearly failed.
And with regards to where we're headed now, and you're putting some warning bells out there, but where do you think the opportunity lies in terms of if we do something now, or I know it's a calling for prediction, but 6 months from now, a year from now, what do you think is going to happen if we ignore those warning bells from the people that have been taking fraud on this?
You have 5 seconds.
Sure. As Senator Wyden in the United States identified, this is just waiting to be a national security risk with the takeover of public officials' accounts, for example.
Thank you. I'm just going to check with the committee if they would like to continue with the next round. We have some study business to approve, so I want to check with the members if it's okay if you'd like to go with the next round as well, and then stay a little bit past 1 o'clock, if that's okay with the members, or would you like us to stop there and deal with the committee business with respect to studies? Okay.
I have one last question, if I can get that in.
Unfortunately, you're completely out of time, Mr. Massey.
Okay, then I would like to continue with the witnesses since we have them here.
Okay. So then, yes, MP Gray?
Sorry, Manager, I have another commitment, so I won't be able to stay later.
Okay, so what we can do is we can go quickly. We can do maybe a 2.5 minute, so that we can, is that fair for the next 2 rounds? Okay, Mr. MP Dreeshen, 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And first of all, then, to Ms. Schroeder, I think listening to the testimony that you had presented, I think one of the things is, once a senior has been duped, no matter what the situation is, I think there's always that fear that, the kids are going to say, well, hey, you can't handle your money, so all of a sudden we're going to have to look after it for you. I really think there has to be more of a campaign, sort of, you're not to blame, because you can see this happening all around. So I think that's perhaps one of the things that you were alluding to, but I'll just try and say it a little more bluntly. But I really think that's something that we should think about in our discussions. And I know, Mr. Baron Chong, that you had talked about various things that we can do, and as I mentioned before in the last, with the seniors, I think investing in public education so that those folks understand that. Could you just comment? You did have a section on this, the Canadian call to action. You've talked about CRTC and how they don't seem to be interested, and you just mentioned how the telecoms seem to be hiding their head in the sand as well. What could you suggest in the next minute and 10 seconds that would help us in that regard?
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile that there be further study into industries and how they're using authentication methods. So in particular, banking, for example, a lot of them still promote text-based two-factor authentication, which, like we mentioned, we're really trying to move away from. So really encouraging these industries that possess, either financially or personally sensitive information, getting them to not only introduce these non-SMS based two-factor authentication methods, but also to proactively encourage their customers to use that. A lot of these apps and things like that ask you for your phone number, and that's the first thing they come out with. You could maybe anticipate it's because they want this extra data part of you, but we really need to get the industry's agencies to really promote non-SMS based 2FA.
Thank you very much. And the last 2.5-minute question will go to Madame Lambropoulos.
Thank you. I'd like to thank both Mr. Baron-Chong and Ms. Schroeder for being with us today to answer our questions. As most of my questions have been answered, I think I'm going to ask a couple of more specific questions to Ms. Schroeder. You were talking statistics before, and you said that this year 4,000 or approximately 4,000 fraud cases have been committed in Canada. Were those specifically seniors or just generally?
Were they specific statistics?
Were they seniors? These are seniors that have been frauded, or it's general?
Those are general
total
Canadians,
population?
yeah.
Do you know how much has affected the senior population specifically?
I don't have the stat available at this particular moment, but I think the scary part of that is that based on what we know, the reporting rates of fraud are extremely low.
Mm-hmm. And the ones that you have worked with specifically, sorry, I've used that word like 5 times already. The ones that you have worked with, are they mainly complaining about cases that they've received on an actual landline or cell phone? What's the more?
I think it's a combination of both. Okay. I think it starts. There are a lot of landlines still, but I do think it is still cell phone based, and then okay. It's both certainly.
Thank you. And Mr. Baron-Chong, I know that you said something that struck me a little bit, and you said that, cell phone companies are often open, especially the business accounts are open from 8 to 4 or whatever, and this is a 24-hour war that these people are fighting. What are specific recommendations with regards to this that you can give us that would help people in your situation in the future?
Yeah, I mean, so after that incident happened with my cell phone, I was able to reach Visa immediately. They have a 24-hour hotline to report fraud. Why is that not the same for the telco companies? I even tried calling the consumer line, which is 24 hours, but they don't have access to my business information. So if you possess financially or personally sensitive information, you should have some form of access to 24-hour hotline to report that and to block that so it can't go further.
Is there any time left?
10 seconds.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Yes, Mr. Massey?
I don't want to be the disruptance, but the schedule we have says till 1 o'clock, and I have one small question to ask the witness here, or to ask indulgent or unanimous consent. Like, ask that one question, it's a simple one, and then just move on. I would just appreciate that from.
Unanimous consent?
Thank you very much, Madam
Mr.
Chair.
Massey?
Just real quickly, with regards to the CRTC study, how important do you think that is done right away?
So long as the door is open, there will be more victims. There needs to be, the CRTC needs to get the plan from the telcos. It needs to understand how it plans to implement it. It needs to be able to enforce the execution of it, and it should involve the public, the users, the people who, are facing these threats.
With that, I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here today and sharing your stories and educating us on the realities that are facing Canadians today. And with that, I'd like to ask the members if they could stay momentarily. We just need to have a review quickly of the 3 study budgets, including the one C4, which has already been concluded, so that we can reimburse witnesses for some of their expenses. So with that, I'd like to thank the witnesses again for joining us today. And I will let the clerk explain the documentation in front of you with respect to the 3 study budgets. Thank you.
Really don't have much else to add. These are all mainly just estimates based on aggregate witness expenses, and any money not spent is clawed back.
I would move the 3 budgets together in one motion if we could.
Okay. Is all in favor of that? Yeah. Okay. All in favor of adoption of all 3 study budgets as indicated on the documentation you have before you? All in favor? Yes. Opposed? Carried. Thank you so much. And with that, we will adjourn. Thank you.
Okay.